Thank you for joining us. I'm Rachel Teagle, founding director of the Manetti Shrem Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's program. While the UC Davis campus remains in a state of reduced operations and we're not able to greet you at the museum, we continue to live our mission by bringing the conversation to you. Before today's program begins, we should take a moment to acknowledge the land on which the museum stands. For thousands of years, this land has been the home of Patwin people. Today, there are 3 federally recognized Patwin tribes: Ketchildehe Band of Wintun Indians of the Calusa Indian Community, Quetzaldehe Wintun Nation, and Yochadehe Wintun Nation. The Patwin people have remained committed to the stewardship of this land over many centuries. It has been cherished and protected as elders have instructed the young through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. Thank you to all of our partners and collaborators, and thank you for joining us today in this virtual gathering space. Now, on to the program.
Thank you everyone for coming. I didn't unmute myself. I'm Susie Cantor. I'm Associate Curator at the Jan Shrem and Maria Manetti Shrem Museum of Art. And I'm so honored to welcome our guests this evening, Bernard Lumpkin, Antoine Sargent, and Matt Wyckoff, who should be joining us on the screen any moment. And we are here this evening to talk about the traveling exhibition and recently published book, Young, Gifted, and Black. I have my copy right here with all of my Post-its in it. The book was published about a month ago from DAP, and you can purchase it online through their website at amazon.com. Antoine's got his copy. And Barnes & Noble. It is actually already on its second printing and is sold out, so I encourage everyone to purchase it immediately before the second printing sells out. So congratulations on that. That's a huge thing that you already had to do a second printing. Before we get into the discussion, I wanted to briefly introduce bios of all of our guests and talk about the collection and the exhibition, and then we'll get into some questions. So just a housekeeping note for our guests or for our audience. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A and we'll try to answer them throughout. And also feel free to use the chat to chat amongst yourselves as you see fit. So first we have Bernard. Bernard I. Lumpkin is a contemporary art collector, patron, and educator whose commitment to both emerging and established artists of African descent is part of a broader mission of institutional advocacy and support. Bernard sits on the Board of Trustees of the Studio Museum in Harlem and the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. At the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, Bernard serves on the Education Committee and on the Painting and Sculpture Committee. Also in New York, at the Museum of Modern Art, he serves on the Media and Performance Committee and is also vice chair of the Friends of Education Patron Group. Bernard has advised public and private organizations on collecting and patronage and has participated in discussion panels at art fairs, auction houses, and universities, like we are here tonight. And during the pandemic, he's been wearing his patron as public advocate hat, which is a phrase I love. Speaking on various panels hosted by arts organizations big and small, from the Frieze Art Fair, where he and Antoine were in conversation just, I think, 2 weeks ago, to the Madison Square Park Conservancy, in order to lend his voice to the difficult but important conversations happening right now around diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion issues in the art world, of which we know there are many. Bernard was educated at Harvard, where he received his AM and PhD, and at Yale, where he received his BA, and where he currently sits on the Dean's Council at the Yale School of Art, and where I believe he has also met a number of the artists in the collection and exhibition. Antoine Sargent is a writer and critic living in New York, and he has contributed articles to the New York Times, Vogue, The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, and various essays to gallery and museum publications. He has curated exhibitions at Aperture Foundation and Jenkins Johnson's Project, and also co-curated with Matt Wyckoff here, the exhibition Young, Gifted, and Black. His first book, The New Black Vanguard, Photography Between Art and Fashion, was published last year with Aperture. And we have Matt Wyckoff, who is an artist, woodworker, and writer living in Brooklyn and Stephentown, New York. For the past 10 years, Matt has also worked as collection curator for the Lumpkin-Boccuzzi family collection. Matt is a MacDowell Fellow, and he's been the recipient of studio fellowships at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts in Omaha, the Urban Culture Project in Kansas City. And recent exhibitions of his work have been at Derek Eller Gallery, Vanity Projects, Joan, and Kijidome, and you can see his work at mattwyckoff.com. So the reason why we're having this conversation tonight is, one, to celebrate the publication of the book, but also because the Manetti Shrem Museum was supposed to be the first stop on the broader exhibition, countrywide exhibition tour of the exhibition. We were supposed to open July 27th. Clearly that couldn't happen this year. So we had to postpone it until 2022, but we're super grateful to have worked with Bernard and his team to be able to do that so that we can still host the exhibition. Towards the end of the tour, it's a robust traveling exhibition. That was the first next slot that was available, so we are happy to take it. But it's given us a really good opportunity to have a sort of engaged lead up to the exhibition and have conversations like this, where we can talk to Bernard and Antoine and Matt. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had Latoya Ruby Frazier, one of the artists in the exhibition, in conversation with Sampara Aranque. And Bernard, I don't know if you saw that talk, but she opened her talk with the photograph that's in the collection and the exhibition. And next week, we have a talk with Claudia Rankin, who's on the reading list for the exhibition. So please, everyone, continue to check back on our website and our social media outlets for developing info as we continue to have programs over the next year or two. And as the on-site curator, I was really lucky to go to the opening at the Lehman College Art Gallery back in February, which seems like a million years ago. I actually flew to New York. And so I've seen the exhibition, but we recognize that a lot of our audience has not necessarily seen it. So I just wanted Antoine and Matt and Bernard to talk a little bit about the exhibition. And I'm just going to run some slides if I can get my screen to work properly. So if you all could maybe just talk a little bit about the exhibition, just briefly explain it to people, and go from there. And then we'll get into the questions, if that makes sense to everyone. Just a quick intro. And here we go. So everyone can see, here's the book. And Bernard, I don't know if you want to start off.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you, Susie. Thank you to Rachel for that introduction. It's been a pleasure partnering with you guys so far. Now our partnership is an extended one between Young Gifted Black and the Manetti Shrem Museum, which has given us the opportunity to get to know you all better and your program, and to sort of celebrate the context in which we will be sharing this exhibition, and which these artists will be sharing space with you, your community, your patrons, and your audience. So just a big thank you, first of all, just for expressing our gratitude and our excitement around this collaboration. I would sort of love to defer to the co-curators, Antoine Sargent and Matt Wyckoff, in part because I spoke with your board today, which was really interesting for me, sort of as a patron, someone who's very engaged with other patrons. I know you mentioned the Madison Square Park Conservancy, which was a panel I did with Ron Pizzuti and also Pamela Joyner, someone in particular who I follow and admire in terms of what she's doing to support artists of color, from the residency that Pamela Joyner has to her support for scholarship around artists of color. So not just exhibiting and acquiring works by artists who have been left out of the art historical canon, but also developing scholarship around those artists so that future generations can learn and read and understand why these artists are so important. Part of the legacy of an artist's career is not just the work, but it's also the critical work that surrounds that art. And so I feel like that's very important that Pamela is supporting artists in this way. There's a lot of heroes that I have and people that I follow in terms of inspiring my work as a patron and a collector. Antoine Sargent, in his essay in the book, talks about the legacy of Black patrons people like myself who supported artists of color, but who did so in a much less hospitable environment. It was the Black critic who's so amazing, Bell Hooks, who talks about how these collectors, the home, the family, the community that happened in homes, it is in itself a museum, was in itself a gathering of people who supported artists. So the importance of the Black home as a space, which, as you can see from behind me, I'm here in our bedroom, but throughout the house and in the kids' rooms, there's obviously a lot of art that we live with. And I hang art in my home, obviously, because I love art, but I also hang art in my home because I think it's an educational tool. I think it's a way of talking about ourselves. It's a way of talking about America. It's a way of talking about race, history, identity. And I feel like, the son of two teachers, and my father was a professor, my mother was a language teacher. What I didn't learn about museums growing up. I didn't go to museums. We didn't collect art. My parents certainly didn't have that sort of opportunity, but they did have the opportunity to teach me the value of education. And whatever I've done in life, I've tried to do so through the lens of education. And so the collection is a very living, active thing in my home, which I feel, is part of what I do as a collector and a patron. And it's part of the public facing and the private facing aspect of what a patron can do. But I sort of went on a tangent there because I was thinking about Antoine's essay in the book. Matt also talks very eloquently and very sensitively as an artist about, the decisions that were made in the course of mounting this exhibition around grouping artists by certain criteria, which he can give you more details on that. But it really gave me a chance to reconsider the collection as a whole and to think about the conversations that are happening among artists and among generations in the collection. And I feel like the whole spirit of this book, Young Gifted Black, is that of a conversation. It's a conversation between myself and these artists that I've been fortunate to collect and to live with over these years. It's a conversation between the artists and the curators and other experts that we asked to write about their work in the book. It's a conversation between and among the artists themselves, something which Thelma Golden talks so much about in terms of what the museum is supposed to do. A museum is supposed to create conversation among artists and between artists and the larger community. So I think we, Matt, Antoine, and I have endeavored to enact some of that spirit in the process of mounting this exhibition and making this book. So it's certainly the spirit of which this conversation happens tonight. And I hope that people listening will be inspired in the same way that I was inspired as I was listening to artists talk about their work and everyone who came together to make this project possible.
Thank you for
That's
that.
my very impromptu introduction, and I'm hoping that's a nice tossing it over to the co-curators who can give you more detail and more color on my sort of like big picture philosophy.
Yeah, thank you for that. Antoine and Matt, as I just sort of scroll through, and I actually did organize the images in the sort of sections of the exhibition for those who don't know it.
Matt, how about you talk about the exhibition and I'll talk about the book? How about we just divide and conquer?
Sure. I mean, just to pick up a little bit on what Bernard was saying, I mean, I had worked with Bernard for almost a decade before, the idea of an exhibition came up. So we had been sort of curating exhibitions from this collection, Bernard and I, in his home for years. So a lot of what I brought to the table sort of grew out of those conversations. So just to sort of start there and sort of as a place to sort of think about the collection and think about different ways to sort of create through lines through the collection. I mean, the collection has nearly 500 works. And so one of the big challenges was to sort of create a narrative that showed the breadth and depth of the collection and also the diversity of the collection. I mean, the book and the project is Young, Gifted, and Black, but you have gay artists, straight artists, male, female, a huge range of age group. And so we wanted to reflect the diversity of the collection and the different approaches. And so I think through a series of, correct me if I'm wrong, Antoine, maybe 3 or 4 meetings, we sort of got a direction in terms of thinking about 4 basic categories. And those were works that dealt sort of primarily with materiality, material experimentation, works that dealt with the color black and blackness, both in terms of the color and in terms of Black identity. And then works that used color, vibrant color, and then portraiture. And so those were sort of the 4 categories that we settled on. And I think they do cover sort of the breadth and depth of the collection. And one of the amazing things is how the works sort of, none of the works are sort of cleanly fit into any one of those categories, but they sort of drift and overlap and sort of move in and out and sort of make you question, oh, well, why is this one in this category and not in this other category? And so the categories were always sort of meant to be fluid and sort of just give a structure to our selections. So Antoine, if you want to add anything, that was sort of the basic thinking and the basic sort of framework that we devised in choosing the works.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you really sort of encapsulated sort of the foundation of the exhibition. I think I'll speak sort of about the book then. I think that when you are trying to think through a collection, right, and trying to think through a sort of diversity of artists, right, in terms of practice, in terms of age groups, in terms of concerns, in terms of materiality, you sort of start to sort of, it becomes a challenge of how do you put that into sort of a book form. And so what we wanted to do, we wanted to use the mission of the collection to guide our thinking, right? And part of the mission of the collection is to collect community, right? And you see that, I think you see that throughout the book in the ways in which not only Bernard, but the artist and curators and other thinkers sort of share insights, right? And so you make sort of a mosaic of the last, sort of several decades of Black artistic production. And so you not only have, sort of the young artists like, Jordan Castile and Eric Mack and Kevin Beasley, who's on the screen, but then you also have their sort of immediate predecessors who they're in conversation with, right? And I think that was sort of important to sort of show that there are ongoing conversations within the space of Black artistic production that is not always sort of visible to the public, right? That doesn't always sort of make it into sort of a public forum like this one, or make it into sort of the museum, right? We often are just sort of left with the works, right? And so I wanted to make sure that we did it at this project really grounded in what does it mean for an artist to make the work, right? And the conditions under which they are working, right? And often there includes a community of curators, of writers, of patrons, of collectors, right? That make the work possible. And so with the book, we wanted to make sure, and the exhibition, you see that in the exhibition as well, but you wanted to make sure that all of those voices were platformed, right? And the histories and the sort of conversations and the disagreements and the departures were all included in the book, right? And so I think that, one of the things that I think people are responding to with this particular book is that, it's with Insane, all of that, Bernard and Carmine have collected a lot, but it's still a young sort of dynamic and changing collection, right? And so I think that, for young collectors or collectors who are newly being acquainted with the artist in the Lumpkin-Boccuzzi collection, the book, sort of acts, in some ways as an introduction, right? As a really sort of intimate introduction. You know, there's a conversation in the book between Thelma Golden, who's the chief curator and director of the Student Museum in Harlem, and Bernard, and they talk about the ways in which they talk about the role of the collector versus the role of the patron, right? And how Bernard's stewardship around these works of young artists have been really, really sort of in others, right? Pamela Jordan, and all the way back to Eileen Locke, right? Who is in some ways really foundational for sort of the contemporary patron, right? Contemporary Black patron, and how those roles as a steward of our culture, of our community, are vitally important because they often are the arbiters of what museums collect, how things end up on walls, how things get made, right? And I think those are just as important roles as the role of artist, right, and the role of curator. And I think that as we're having a conversation, as a country, as a culture, about the about sort of what role would the museum play, right, in sort of the coming years, I think that we're also examining sort of what roles each of the positions that make up a museum, right, have to offer, right? Should they be reformed? How should it be reformed? How should collections, be expanded or reformed? What sort of curator should we have in museums? What sort of patrons, right? What sort of ties should they have to, say, the community or to business or to society, right? These are all sort of questions we're actively grappling with, and about time. And so I think that this book really, is an opportunity for us to sort of see the way that one sort of patron has acted, and in my sort of estimation, has acted with integrity, has acted in a way that you speak to the artist, there are stories that some of the artists tell in the book of their interactions with Bernard, that speaks to the mission of collection and the community that he's built around the artists and the works that they make. And so all of that is in the book. And, if you don't have one, I hope that you do get an opportunity to get one.
Thank you so much. That there's a lot that you've said in there that I want to get back to, particularly thinking
Sure.
about museums and roles. But one thing that you focus on that I want to ask Bernard about, and all of you weigh in, is this idea of community, which is so clearly important and so beautifully drawn out in the book, but also thinking about the exhibition and the way that Bernard, you describe yourself as an advocate and a patron and all these different ways to describe what you do. And there's sort of these three pillars that I've seen that you talk about recently in our conversations and in the book that you that sort of seem to drive what you're doing. And I was hoping you could talk about how these ideas of community, but also family and education really shape your collecting and your mission, and how do you carry them out in various ways. And then I also, after that, want to get back to some of what Antoine was saying about museums and all sorts of other good stuff.
Sure. Thanks, Antoine. I love hearing both you guys, Matt and Antoine, talk about the book and the exhibition, because it's always refreshing to remember sort of the conversations that have started this project and that continue to inspire me. As I said sort of briefly, my parents were both educators, and my parents were also, I have an interesting sort of ethnic and racial background. My father was African American, born and raised in South Central Los Angeles. My mother was Sephardic Jewish, emigrated to the United States from Tangiers, Morocco. My sister and I were raised sort of in, celebrating both religions, and we were sort of simultaneously aware of our privilege. My father was a professor at UCSD, and we lived in La Jolla, California, which is, as many of you know, is a very beautiful place to live and not a very diverse place. But we had the privileges of that. But then we were always made aware of, sort of from my father's background and where my mother came from in Morocco, of are sort of very close, struggles that our families had separately because they didn't have certain privileges. So I think that drove both of my parents to be educators and to teach and to try to help people understand what difference means and what it looks like and what it doesn't look like. Being someone who also passed, I think the experience of passing is something which is one of those topics for me, which drove and has driven my collecting and my conversation with artists who are interested in sort of depicting and exploring through their work what it means to be misread or misrepresented. There's some specific artists in the collection whom I have known and whom I've had conversations about this. I obviously think first off the top of my head of Christina Quarles, who talks about this in the context of her painting being mixed race. And my first conversations with her actually at Skowhegan were about our experience of being mixed race and passing and what that meant. And even before we got to her work, which you can see now, we talked about our own experience in that way. But, looking, Christina Quarles is someone who I'm sure would acknowledge that people like Adrian Piper, who is obviously not young and gifted in Black, but certainly is a huge figure for many of the artists in the book, conceptual artists who dealt early on in her work with race specifically, and also the experience of passing, was a big influence. And so I think for me, the education has always been the starting point. Even when I was a producer at MTV for a long time, I worked in the sort of PBS wing of the channel, producing documentaries and news stories on social issues. This was a time when young people got a lot of their news from MTV. They only got their news from MTV. And so, in between sort of the more popular shows that you think of when you think of MTV, I was part of the team of people who was producing these sort of short 30-minute infomercials on the war in Iraq, or voting, how to vote in America in an election, or issues around, racial and economic issues affecting young people, education, things like that. So, for me, the collection, and by extension, everything I do as a patron, is really in that same spirit. And, I think it extended to my interest in joining museums. I often say to collectors who are starting out, it's like, identify what you're interested in, train your eye, and then join forces with other people who are also sharing that passion with you and who share that interest with you. And that often means joining a museum committee or an arts organization. And I was remembering today with a curator that my first ever patron committee that I joined wasn't even a collection committee. It wasn't like the painting and sculpture committee at the Whitney, which I serve on now, or the media and performance art at MoMA, which I serve on. It was actually the education committee at the Whitney Museum. And, for me, that was a natural starting point from my own background, and also for, I think, where I wanted to take my journey, or how I wanted to chart my journey as a patron, was starting with education. And it's through serving on that committee that I've learned a lot about what museums, and this sort of touches on maybe a subsequent topic, which is museums and the general public and the communities that museums serve. The education department is in essence, it's the department that sort of sells the shows to the public. And so the education department is the interface between the museum and the community that the museum serves. And, whether it's a docent tour, whether it's a tour for elderly people, whether it's programs and classes around exhibitions, the education department is often sort of the public facing part of the museum. And so being involved in that department has sort of taught me a lot about what museums have to confront. And, by that, I mean what museums ought to confront and what museums are sort of, like it or not, forced to confront. And, the Whitney Museum, as an example, had protesters in their lobby not too long ago when the museum was open. And so I think for me, it's no fun and it's no purpose and there's no spirit if you're not doing this with the idea that you're in some way helping people understand their lives, helping people understand the world better. And I feel that that's sort of the spirit of the collection, of the book, and of my service to arts institutions.
Thank you for that. That's part of why we're so excited to be working with you as a university art museum, where we think about our audiences as students and faculty in the greater university sort of community. But it's interesting that you sort of gravitated to talking about museums and thinking about what Antoine was just saying about what role do museums play and the different people in museums. And Bernard, I've heard you say in various talks recently that art history isn't made on your walls, it's made on museum walls. So I was hoping maybe the three of you could talk about just where you see the role of museums going and how that might be changing and how this sort of fits into it. And maybe even just thinking on the conversation we were just starting on right before we went live of talking about the Baltimore Art Museum. If you want to bring that into it, you don't have to, but just the different ways that museums sort of, create art history, as you say, and the ways that what you're doing can help change that or make a different sort of art history.
Well, I think that I'll start. I think that I would complicate that. I would trouble it a little bit, right? I think that the fact is that maybe art history isn't made on people's private walls, but it is preserved on their walls, right? And I think that distinction is important, because as you look at artists like Ed Clark, and you look at all these sort of artists that are having this maybe third wind at this point, not second, not first, third, someone had to have that work, someone had to collect that work, right? And often that was long before the limelight, long before the record-setting auction prices, that were Black patrons, right? There were Black collectors, right? Who were using, much like Bernard, their homes as a place to show the work and as a place to display the work, so they could display aspects of their culture, aspects of their identity, aspects of their history that you were not seeing in mainstream media, right? And I think that one of the first sort of spaces that Black people have quote unquote curated are their living spaces, right? Long before allowed into museums, long before Black artists were allowed into museums. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge, Bernard talked about bell hooks, right? And how bell hooks, in this essay that she wrote talks about the ways in which images, photographs, were put into frames and hung, with care and intention on the walls of her home and her grandparents' home in the South, right? And that was the first place that she saw, Black beauty, right? And she, thinks of that sort of intimate space as it was, right? As a space of control, as a space of desire, as a space of history, right? As a reflection of Blackness that was not seen in mainstream society, right? In some ways still isn't being seen in mainstream society, right? And I think that, it's important to say that, although, art history might not, is written, which is, there's a whole other sort of set of structural sort of racism that comes with that, right? It is preserved there. And it is a space that, it takes me back to a conversation, again, to this conversation that me, Thelma, and Bernard had around how Thelma was saying that, and I'm paraphrasing, but she talks about all the artists who might have been hot in the moment, who might have been collected, who might have done big shows in a moment, and then they sort of just, for whatever reason, didn't make it into the museum, right? Or they made it into the museum and the work was put in storage and never critically engaged, right? Because that happens too, right? That's not, once you make it into the museum, it's just one of many sort of hurdles, right? You need curators there that care about the work, that are going to investigate the work, that are going to bring critical lens to the work, right? But she talked about sort of artists that grew, when she was coming up, some of them making and some of them didn't, and how when people came back around, it was very often that the artists were preserved by collectors and patrons who were serving sort of a higher calling than sort of the sort of market game, right? Than sort of the like who's hot right now game that is often played, you know, in the press and museums and, you know, galleries, right? And so there was a long-term view of culture, of these objects as culture, as, you know, important enough to preserve, because of the sort of experimentation and artistic greatness of them, right? Which often operates outside of sort of what we have come to sort of call the museum, and the ways in which museums, you know, have operated, you know, in terms of, you know, Blackness, right? I mean, we're sort of in sort of the first several years of, you know, of museums saying, you know, our collections are, you know, too white or too male to, you know, this, right? And so museums have not done the work on this, right? And it has been people like Bernard, people like Pamela, people like, the list sort of goes on and on, right? That you can keep sort of naming folks, AC Hodges, et cetera, you know, who Peggy, you know, who did this work, right? And who were a community for artists when the museums were not sort of involved, right? And so I just wanted to sort of complicate that a little bit, because the museums owe a great debt to these sort of, you know, patrons.
Absolutely. I don't know, Bernard, do you have any thoughts, or Matt? I think there's a lot of conversations that are just starting to happen or haven't always been happening, but I think you're right of that these things were, these patrons were doing the work when the institutions weren't.
I mean, I was just, I guess, pointing to Matt, since Susie, you mentioned in your conversations, you two, Matt and Antoine, about the collection and like sort of like looking at the collection as a whole and then figuring out what stories you wanted to tease out in order to make the exhibition and to then sort of make the book. Were you guys sort of conscious or aware of these sort of this lineage, or and also of the need to sort of confound people's expectations about what Young, Gifted, and Black looks like? I'm curious to know if some of these issues crossed your mind then versus now.
I mean, it makes me think of, Bernard, you and I were just in conversation with Tamashi Jackson, one of the artists in the book and the exhibition, just a couple of weeks ago. And she said during our conversation, art history is social history. And,
Right.
and I think that's true, but I think it's a much bigger statement, I think, than people might think initially. I mean, I think not too long ago that would have gotten a lot of pushback. I mean, I think there was a huge effort to separate art history from social history, because the social history of this country in particular, and in a lot of places, was such a mess, is such a mess, that I think it was easier for people to sort of separate art history from social history. And so to think about what Tamashi said, art history is social history, and to think about the implications of that going forward on the museum is really pretty profound. You know, if that is going to be the case, there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, you know, to bring that into the conversation. And I think Antoine and I were sort of very aware of the modernist narrative of art historical progress, and that the conversation to sort of take that down, that's been happening over the last 20 years, maybe, in various forms. You know, we wanted to be aware of that. And I think in the works that we chose, you know, a lot of them sort of deal with things that you haven't seen on the museum walls. You know, you haven't seen a Black gay man sort of dealing with those, with being a Black gay man right out in front. You haven't seen that at MoMA. You know, you haven't seen that in so many places. And I think we really wanted to sort of bring those sort of things into those kind of conversations into the exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that, you know, there's a wall where you have Kerry James Marshall and you have Sable, Ellie Smith, and you have a few other works, and you don't often see, you know, Kerry's work in conversation with other artists, right? You often, you know, we often silo, you know, our great artist, right? And so it was just really important to make sure that, you know, that we were showing that lineage, right? Because, you know, we will, people, you know, there's just a lack of, you know, sort of, there's on one hand really great scholarship, but there, and, you know, there's also just sort of, um, there's a, you know, there's a great sort of art historical academic, say, scholarship, right? But in the popular sort of imagination, which is, you know, where I often work and I think is just important, um, because you're trying to reach as many publics as possible, right? Um, that you don't see this lineage, right? You don't see the fact that Carrie's experimentation with the color black, with blackness, right, as a social condition and as a color, had now influenced several generations, right? Which is which is that's why it's important that like the book is sort of divided the way it is that, you know, it's a focus on this generation, right? Because that's where in a lot of ways Bernard has, you know, in the collection has really made a real impact, right? um, but there are other works in the collection as well that speaks to the lineage, right, and the history, and this sort of progress that has been made artistically, right? And then there's also all those conversations, like Matt said, about modernism, about abstraction, about sort of, you know, what Chris Bedford wrote an essay in Pamela's book, actually, about this notion of social abstraction, right? And how that sort of, you know, is at play in a number of works here, right? This Bethany Collins work here that we're looking at, right? That deals with Blackness as a color, right? But then she's also thinking about sort of her mixed race identity, right? In the landscape of extraction, right? Which, as Chris sort of argues, is a fundamentally Black contribution to abstraction, right? And so all of those conversations are happening, right? And we wanted to sort of, you know, give space to that. But I think that, like, you know, it's so important in this moment to make sure that, like, because we're still not in the museum or in, you know, the popular press, the New York Times, or, you know, whatever, talking about the ways in which, you know, Black artist communities and how Black artist communities supported each other. And I think that, you know, making a provocative statement like Young, Gifted, and Black allows for others to be seen in that statement, right? Because if you think about young, then you have to be old, right? You think about, you know, it really is sort of a way to sort of bring in other generations and other histories, and talk about how they directly impact the opportunities that this current generation of artists who have unbelievable opportunities in terms of showing work, who has unbelievable opportunities in terms of having their work collected, having unbelievable opportunities in having their work written about. You know, previous generations didn't have this, maybe one or two, you know, 3 or 4, maybe, you know, but not, you know, sort of this many artists being discussed and debated and having their work shown, you know, and across platforms, right? You see it on social media, right? But you also see it on, say, the cover of Vogue, where Jordan and Carrie, James Marshall, both did covers, you know, in September. Then you see it in museums, right? And so you're having sort of this conversation in this way that sort of exceeds just a museum, right? And their concerns are being sort of more popularly sort of debated and understood and critically engaged, right? Which is the first time, right, that we're really getting this in this sort of way, right? There are other moments, right? You think about the 1960s, 1970s, you think about the 1920s, right? Like there are other moments, right? But I think that hopefully what makes this different is that, you know, is that if we're able to sort of use this moment as a moment of transformation, that it won't just be a moment, right? We won't just be talking about, you know, these artists, or I guess, let me rephrase that. Some of us have been talking about these artists, you know, for years and years and years and years and years, and we'll continue to do that work, right? But we hope that, you know, it's not a fad institutionally. And I think that, or, you know, in the papers or whatever. And I think the way to only ensure that is to change those, is to change our institutions.
Yeah, I mean, and just to sort of pick up, I think the danger that one can get into is to say, oh, look, all of a sudden there's all these Black artists making this great work, and it's like, wait. You know, and I think you know, Antoine dealing with in his essay going back and doing the history of Black patronage, and the exhibition showing the generation that sort of preceded the younger generation that we focus on, and really rooting the whole project in history and saying this work has been there. The Black artists have been there making work all along, and it's just now there's attention being paid to it. And so making that distinction clear to everyone and not letting the narrative be, oh, look, all of a sudden there's these Black artists making great work. You know, the Black artists have been there making the contributions, making the great work. And it's just that the attention wasn't being paid. So I think, you know.
I think there's also, like, you know, there's also something else has to happen, I think has to change, right? And what that is that it can't be like, oh, we just sort of discovered, or as you said, you know, now in this moment, all this is happening. You know, you also have to do the other work around, okay, so these museums have been around forever. The curators, the critics, they've all, I mean, this is not a world that changes very frequently, right? People hold those jobs forever, right? I think there needs to be some challenge around, why did you miss it? What were you doing that you've missed this work? Because, and I say that because, like, you can't have the same people, and I really fundamentally believe this, you can't have the same people who've missed it now write those stories. Because, and if you look at sort of the shows that are going up, and you look at sort of the reviews that are happening, there's always just something like not right about them, you know? And not to sort of call out, so, you know, Dina Lawson, who's in the show and who's in the book, you know, won this really great award for photography, you know, at the Guggenheim. She won the Hugo Prize Prize. She's the first photographer who have made that achievement, right? It was a great day for contemporary Black photo, right? But then you read in, and I won't say the paper because it doesn't really matter because they all make the mistakes, you know, like you read sort of a congratulations to her and, you know, in a paper, and it goes, you know, she makes images of African Americans, and, you know, most people just like sort of keep on reading, right? But to someone who it's totally engaged with Dina's work critically, you say, you go to yourself, wait, she's globally sort of making a thread of Black people. Not all of them are African Americans, and how do you not get that? And how do you print that in your paper, right? And so I think that, like, we need to endeavor to not just sort of stop at, oh, there's record number of shows, there's record number of money being made, but to really sort of push our, you know, the press and the writers and the museums to really get this stuff right, because if they don't, these moments happen all the time. You know, we're hot and then we're not, we're hot and then we're not, we're hot. How do you sort of break that cycle? And I think that the only way to do that is to make sure that all of the institutions that create value and all the people that create value live by a different sort of ethical standard than we've had in the past and until this moment.
I
Yeah,
agree.
that's a great. I'm sitting here taking some notes from quoting you guys. The Antoine's, your point about you know, about you can't have the same people. Someone else quoted it in the chat. What is it? Let's see. You can't have the same people who missed it write those stories. Boom. Sorry. And Matt, also what you're saying about, you know, the Black artists of being shown for the first time, or being, you know, shown in this way, I think is also really, you know, it's like, you know, it's like we've been there kind of thing. It's like this has been happening, and there's also a question about sort of Black Lives Matter and the pandemic, and you know, I think this work has been happening for a long time. There have been fewer people doing the work. There have been fewer eyes looking at the work. There have been fewer supporters for the work, as Antoine pointed out, and as I did at the top of the show. Like, there have been very few people writing about the work. Thankfully, some patrons like Pamela Joyner are taking care of that. So I think, you know, it's interesting that this show is very much about what's happening now, but it's also a history lesson on what has been happening. And let's not let that happen again.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of idea of rewriting history as much as you can. It's that it's both backward and forward looking, of trying to correct, but also correct for future generations, so that it again, as you say, it doesn't happen again. And how do we keep this moment not just a moment, but something that continues through? And I think,
And
it's also
it's
about
tough.
who you're writing for, right? So often, you know, we say, you know, about, you know, our writing, and we, you know, very, you know, the art world, you know, we're very sort of obsessed with sort of this insider baseball language, right? But then when it comes to, you know, audiences, you want to have the broadest, you know, you want to reach the broadest public as possible. You're saying that the work's for everybody, and but the language is not reflective of that, right? And that's not just sort of, you know, I'm a writer, that's just not us as writers, but it's also the way that, you know, artists are sort of, there's this trend of sort of using academics for that, you know. And I'm not sort of against academia, but I do think that the work should be generous enough that if it's going to sit in an institution and be available to the public, then the public should have access to that work and the very complicated ideas. And no one's saying dumb it down or whatever, but I do think that you know, there's been a real investment in one kind of writing, right, and not sort of an investment in another type of writing. That I think that we should also sort of examine, right? There's a real sort of investment in a certain type of crowd of person you want to come to, you know, the show or whatever, but not sort of a larger sort of communal effort. And I think if we're going to use words like community, then we really need to mean that, right? And we really need to sort of think about how do we ensure that the people who you say the work is about, those people end up in the galleries, right? And it's not just sort of rhetorical, sort of, you know, it's not just rhetoric, right? And it really is sort of meaningful, right? And I think a lot about that. I think a lot about how, you know, if you ask, you know, you go randomly walk down the street and ask people, do they love art? You know, very few people will say no, right? And so, but why isn't that reflected in our institutions? And attendances in our institutions, right? And so I'm always sort of thinking about that, and I'm always thinking about like just trying to be as intentional as possible around projects like this. And you know, I think that it's one of the reasons we all had this discussion around like making sure it was a university, that this was this show particularly toward or mostly sort of toward universities, was because this could be sort of their immediate, you know, predecessors speaking to them, right? Like most of these artists in the exhibition and in the book are quite young, you know. Most of them are sort of under the age of, I would say, 35, you know. And some of them are just finishing grad school, and some of them are, you know, and so you have this spectrum of you know, knowledge that is sort of closer to the university sort of, you know, experience in age. And we were so intentional about wanting that to be the audience for this show, right? The next generation, right? Because they can see, if one generation, if they can see what's possible for one generation, perhaps that can inspire, you know, them to, you know, not even necessarily follow in their footsteps, but to sort of beat their own path, right? And so I think that like we need to have some of that more sort of you know, that sort of intentional thinking around our institutions, right? Around, you know, how they operate and who they're for.
Yeah, I mean, something you said, Antoine, maybe 5 or 8 or 10 minutes ago about values. You know, I mean, if I mentioned the sort of modernist narrative of the sort of hierarchical narrative of art, this movement follows this movement, that sort of left out the sort of social aspects. You know, if you know, that narrative was rooted in a patriarchal sort of racist society, and so if we want to build a new narrative, you know, we have to get the values of the society right. You know, like we have to really, the narratives that we build have to be rooted in values that we can really sort of get behind, you know, that we can really believe in. And then the narratives that grow out of that, you know, which really gets us back to community, like, and why what Bernard is doing is so valuable, because he's actually building a community. And so the narratives that have grown out of that have this integrity that I think, you know, could be a model for, you know, for institutions, for, you know, other people trying to sort of build new narratives. You know, if we're trying to sort of build a new narrative, I think it's rooted in the values of the society. And so I think that's an important sort of point to pick up on, that I think you mentioned, but maybe got sort of passed by.
Yeah, it's also interesting, you know, I think what Antoine said is very true. Like, you know, unless we want the same lesson to be repeated, unless we want the same mistakes to be made, we do have to have some new people in the room. And when I say the room, I mean the exhibition room, the lobby of the museum where the public enters, what Antoine is talking about in terms of, you know, who are we inviting into this conversation? Who are we making these exhibitions for? Are we representing the communities that we serve, the communities that support us? And then, of course, you know, the boardroom, the rooms where decisions are made at museums, like private institutions, like nonprofit institutions. You know, they're run by a certain group of people. And what does that group of people look like? Where do they come from? What are their values? What do they believe in? And that gets very complicated, and that's a very daunting task. I think everyone's asking the questions now that are correct. You know, how can we better represent, how can museums better represent themselves? How can museums better serve the communities that they're a part of? The answer is complicated. You know, how can you achieve economic diversity on boards when, you know, museums need every cent and dollar that they can get? And it's true, in order to enact all of these changes, it costs a lot of money. And, you know, the reality is that, you know, there's economic inequality in this country. And so the people who are at those tables aren't necessarily going to be the people that are, have not been the people that could represent, you know, what the future of the museum needs to be. You know, I, for myself, certainly don't want to be like the affirmative action board member. I'm only speaking for myself. And I just, you know, it's something that I feel strongly about, that if I'm joining a board and I'm echoing, you know, other patrons, you know, like me, that I admire, if I'm asked to join a board, I want to know specifically why I'm there. You know, what am I bringing to the table? What unique contribution am I making, aside from, you know, whatever financial contribution I'm making? You know, I think that's, for me, that's what inspires me, is to sit around that table, to learn from the people around me, and to recognize that, you know, that person thinks differently than I do, has different experience, has different skills, but, you know, I'm sure glad that they're here with me in this room deciding whether we're going to do this exhibition, because that voice is important, even though I don't necessarily agree with it, or even though I don't necessarily want to have, you know, drinks with this person afterwards. I sure am happy to be working with them, partnering with them in this conversation, in this job. So, you know, I think board service, for some people, with the way I thought it was growing up, it was sort of like a privilege. It was like something that your uncle did or your parents did, and you just sort of like joined boards because that's what, you know, you were sort of given. That it was like a privilege, it was like a right. But, you know, I certainly don't see my service on these boards as being a privilege or a right. I look at it as work, and hard work, and good work, important work. And I hope that, you know, others will be inspired to see it in that way. And I hope institutions who haven't necessarily seen board members, or haven't tasked board members to think about things like, you know, DEAI, diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, to think about, the infrastructures, to think about, the staff and what their role is in the life of an institution. I think we need to begin to rethink what a board is and does in a way that builds on the current, foundation and keeps what works and maybe updates some things where they need to be updated.
Thank you. We are actually just about out of time. I know it goes by fast. It does. So I just wanted to end with you, Bernard, you touched on this at the beginning, and you all have been sort of saying in different ways, but if, we hopefully have a lot of our students in the audience and people who are maybe aspiring collectors or aspiring writers, aspiring artists and curators, if you have any words of advice before we head out for the evening, just to, especially thinking about all the things that you have been saying about really needing to make the change from within, just any sort of last words of advice.
I mean, I would defer to Matt, who's, among my community of practicing artist friends, to really talk about that specifically, what, for an artist. And I would defer to Antoine to talk about, whatever kind of artist you are, whatever work you're making, maybe, think about how that work lives in the world, and to be thoughtful and careful about that. But I would defer to Matt and Antoine to go deeper on those points.
I mean, I would say, just as an artist, locating your own sort of personal identity within a larger and larger set of information. Don't make that set of information smaller. Always seek to make it larger. I mean, that's been a sort of guiding sort of principle and sort of how I think about identity, how I think about the idea of the self, sort of trying to always expand that circle by which you can sort of define yourself. More information, so that's really, I think, a huge thing for me, and has been sort of a guiding principle, for me. Other than that, I wouldn't hazard to offer too much advice.
Yeah, I mean, I guess along the sort of lines that, we've been talking tonight, my sort of advice for, young artists, and I mean that broadly, writers and art, people who are painters and photographers, is, sort of have integrity with what you do, and really sort of, because you're going to need it, and really sort of endeavor to tell the stories and make the work that you believe you need to be making, and not sort of responding to, say, a cultural moment or a market or whatever, right? Like, I would say, do the work that you need to do.
Those are great words to end on. Thank you so much to Antoine, to Bernard, to Matt for being here tonight and sharing your wisdom and your thoughts and having a really honest and open conversation. We really appreciate it. And thank you to our audience for being here. And we hope everyone joins us next week for the reading and lecture by Claudia Rankin, which is next Wednesday, November 4th at 4 p.m.
Her book is great. I just finished it, actually.
I haven't read it yet. It's on my list.
Yes. It's big letters, so you can get through it really quickly, actually.
That's the state we're in this.
Yeah, exactly. I'm like, you have to sort of, really interesting book. But thank you guys so much.
It's funny, there was a conversation tonight with Claudia Rankin at the New Museum, like tonight at our same time.
Oh gosh.
Oh, we're
like right now.
Competing with Claudia?
Yeah, there's like, it's in the moment.
Well, you can see her next week.
Next week.
Yeah.
Next week, maybe I'll tune in. All right. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.